Metaphor is extremely important to understanding our species, how we think, how we relate to each other, how we talk about the world, how we conceive the world. And Lakoff and Johnson are owed an incredible debt by everybody for their pioneering breakthrough work on showing us examples. But ultimately, metaphor can only be understood as a small part of the theory of semiotics and human culture that underwrites all metaphors.
Welcome to The Story of Language, an original podcast series about language, linguistics, cognition, and culture. My name is Christian Saunders and I am an English teacher. And throughout this series, I will be in discussion with Dan Everett, linguist, anthropologist, philosopher, and author. In this episode, we talk about the fundamental role of metaphor in language, from its involvement in the creation and evolution of language, to its role in the modern understanding of language through the work of Lakoff and Johnson and the study of semiotics. If you would like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter at Story of Language, or you can send us an email at storyoflanguage@gmail.com. This is episode 7 of The Story of Language. Have you sort of suffered any ill side effects from all of your years in the jungle? You know, and is there any long-term effect on your health?
I don't know. I don't think so, but it's hard to say. You see people recover from injuries and all sorts of things, and then as they get older, these things come back to haunt them because the body really didn't get over it. But I don't know. The main thing, I guess, is to try to keep as active as possible as you age. But I have plenty to keep me busy intellectually. So that's a good thing.
I don't know if you agree, but I say to my wife all the time that the worst thing that people can do is retire, because generally, a lot of people they've had a kind of 9-to-5 job their whole life, and then they retire, and then suddenly they kind of lose the reason to get out of bed in the morning, and then that's it,
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing thing. I never have felt the desire to retire. At 68, I'll be 69 in July. One of the reasons I left the UK is because there you see all these lawsuits right now going on between Oxford and some of its very senior people because they're getting over 67 and Oxford's firing them. They call it retirement, but it's just firing people based on their age. I will guarantee you that there's no junior assistant professor, even if they're twice as smart as me, who currently knows as much as me. And I'm at the peak of my abilities. If I were getting terrible teaching evaluations and I weren't doing research, then I think that universities have to be able to get rid of people like that. But if you're active and you're continuing to build systematically on the cognitive resources you've developed over a lifetime, it's utterly ridiculous to force people to retire. And in my way of thinking, it doesn't even make sense for people to retire to begin with.
Well, speaking of sort of age and time, that sort of leads me into what we're going to talk about today in episode 7, which is about metaphor. And I wanted to just start by asking a question. So some estimates of the amount of metaphor in everyday language put it as low as like 3 or 4%. Like when they look at a big corpora of language and they look at how many kind of phrases are based on metaphors, it's about 5%. But then there are other people, like for example Lakoff in this amazing book Metaphors We Live By, who would say that metaphor actually makes up almost all of language. So Where do you kind of feel, which one do you feel is more correct?
Well, I suggest that it would lean more towards Lakoff's estimation. I've never really done any kind of quantitative study of how much of regular speech is metaphor, but that book came out, Metaphors We Live By, when I was doing my PhD in Brazil, and as it turns out, George Lakoff was there as a visiting professor, and I was sharing my office at the time with John Searle. There was some big event happening in Brazil, and we had all these great people down there. And I remember Lakoff was really pushing his book, and John Searle in class says, "Yeah, this book is full of a lot of examples, but I don't see any theory in it at all." And I thought, gosh, I hope someday I can be that arrogant. But, to be so self-confident that I can take a major scholar, super famous guy and say, yeah, not very good. And it turns out that I do that too. But I talked to Lakoff a lot about this. And on the one hand, I do agree with Searle now, after many years, that I don't think there's much of a theory of what metaphor comes from. But I do think there's a huge amount of extremely important work that's come out of Metaphors We Live By on the applications of metaphor and looking for metaphors and looking how it controls us. A lot of the entire movement called embodied cognition comes out of Lakoff's work on Metaphors We Live By, because we use our body to talk about our mind. We use our body, so like among the Piraha, you talk about the back of a house, like you do here. You talk about the top of a house, the head of the house in Piraha. It's not the top of the house, it's the head of. Well, these are metaphors. These are using the body to talk about other experiences. And we do this all the time. And I don't think that Lakoff is probably all that far off, Lakoff and Johnson, when they talk about metaphors. And they've done a lot of other really good work on metaphor. But to me, the theory of metaphor has to come out of something much deeper, such as Peirce's semiotics. And I think that's really where the best theory of metaphor is found. But if we think about all the uses of metaphor, people ask you, what does your name mean? So your name is Christian. Are you a Christian? Well, who was a Christian? We're always looking for meaning. What's the analogy? We talk about American Indian names of the plains, Chief Rain in the Face and Red Cloud and all this kind of stuff. What does that mean? We're looking for the meaning. Well, is it a metaphor? Is Red Cloud somebody who, when he's angry, red clouds appear to represent his anger? Or is his anger like the red clouds of the storm? Or is it just the fact that he was born when there were red clouds over his mother? But we want to find these deeper meanings. People are always asking me, so what does my name mean? My name, Daniel, means God is my judge. It's sort of a nice name. Eberhard, which is the source of Everett, means hard as a wild boar. But then the Eberhards went to France and it became Everett, which just means little pig. And then they went with the French, they were happily slaughtering their fellow Anglo-Saxons in England.
It's a shame that your name went from, strong kind of heart of a boar, which is like a wild, ferocious animal, to just little pig.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, there may be many people who thought that was an appropriate evolution. But what is it? It doesn't mean, I don't think of it anymore. I don't think of my name and compare myself to a pig. It's just a name now. But a lot of names do come from metaphors. At some point, the origins, Eberhard was a metaphor. He is like a boar. So where do we get these comparisons? What is the cognitive basis of these things? What is the linguistic or semiotic basis of metaphors? And then what good are they why do so many people have them? I don't make claims like every culture has X, because I haven't visited every culture. And I think that's an empirical claim. But I have never found a culture that doesn't have metaphor. I've never read of a culture that doesn't have metaphor.
Well, I was going to ask you actually about if the Peter Han, for example, who in a lot of ways are the most different language users that certainly that I know about. If they use metaphor in similar ways to the way we use it in English.
Yeah, I mean the verb to run in Peter Han is to hit the ground with a big foot. I mean that they don't just have a verb to run; it's to hit with a big foot. That's metaphorical. Because nobody's foot actually grows when they're running, right? It's just you're pounding when you're running, and so it sounds like a big foot. And they use like in the parts of houses, and they have they certainly use similes all the time. There's a word igyabe, which means like, and so they make similes all the time. And similes and metaphors and analogies are all variants of what Peirce called icons. So a metaphor is to language as a painting is to eyes. For Peirce, it's a transfer or a linking of properties we see in one thing with the properties in another thing. So if it is realistic art like the Mona Lisa, then we can see the connections much more transparently. If it's abstract art or impressionistic art, the connections, but ultimately anybody can see anything in anything, right? So metaphors are not limited by rule. Peirce used to say that anything can be a metaphor for anything. It just depends on the properties the individual person wants to look at, but it also depends on the properties that are licensed by the culture. So the ability to see similarities, and we're always looking for metaphor. When we don't understand something right away, we're trying to analyze it metaphorically. A metaphor just means to carry over or to transfer. I had a paper by a graduate student many years ago. What's a metaphor? But like meta and then FOR, like a little play on words.
Okay, nice.
I gave him quite a low grade for that. That irritated me. But it is a transfer, a carrying over of something, and that's only limited by our individual and cultural cognitive foundation.
I've heard people tell me specific examples, like, for example, the metaphor of reaching for the stars in kind of Anglo-Saxon culture is a positive thing, because it's like, you're really trying to be the best, and right. It's like space is a metaphor for achievement. But in Chinese culture, the same metaphor is negative, because it's a bit like you're above your station, you're egotistical, right? Yeah.
So we see the exact same property is interpreted very differently based on the culture. Peirce said that icons fall into two broad categories: images and metaphors. And among images, there are diagrams. So a sentence diagram, like you would draw in linguistics or in English class, is in a sense an icon. I mean, it's an icon of that sentence. You're looking at the properties that you want to look at it. The sentence, it's showing certain kinds of relationships that are important to your theory. Whereas a metaphor is an icon of more abstract properties or less direct connections. I can say this branch in the diagram represents this thing in the sentence. Whereas in a metaphor, you sort of have to invent these things, and then we agree that we'll do them. But if you give somebody a sentence like Chomsky's famous colorless green ideas sleep furiously, people look at that and try to interpret it. And they don't try to interpret it literally. They try to interpret it metaphorically, because that's our job as speakers. You tell me a sentence, I don't understand you. I'll first try to understand it in the context and literally, maybe a little bit less literally. But if it makes no sense at all, I'll try to understand it metaphorically. It's and we see jokes on this all the time. So the famous and hilarious movie on folk music, a mighty wind. You know, that's a great metaphor. It's a mighty wind. But it also is a metaphor for lots of things. You're going to mean somebody was passing gas. It can mean they're just a blowhard. They just talk too much. It could mean that it's a movement that's caused by their beautiful singing, the wind that comes out of their lungs. And none of those are right or wrong, except as we try to apply them to this a determined context.
I do actually, and I know this probably, maybe it makes me kind of an outlier, but when I first read, Colorless Green Ideas Sleep Furiously, I did have some kind of visual image in my mind of what that might be like. It didn't actually strike me as a sentence that was impossible. It struck me more as a sentence that was more kind of maybe poetic rather than impossible.
Yeah, I mean, studies of that sentence, I mean, there are actually award-winning poems written on that sentence now, which is kind of hilarious. But there have been studies by computer scientists that show that if you take all those words and you put them in the most statistically expected order, that's the order they'll be in. So you don't need syntax to explain why they'll be in that order. The original example was to show that syntax is distinct from semantics. So you can have a syntactically well-formed and semantically poorly formed thing. I also agree that semantics and syntax are quite different things. And I'll be talking in April at the University of Cambridge in the UK about these things and using Piraha. But we try to interpret new experiences metaphorically if we can't interpret them literally, because what is it? We're trying to find something we do understand as a way of talking about something we've not sure we understand. So, it's like, and there again, when I say like, I'm using a simile, which is a metaphor. We can't reason without it.
Yeah. No, it's funny what you're saying about how syntax and semantics are distinct, and they are. But I think after having to explain to students
right.
for so many years, like why things, to second language learners, kind of why things are the way they are in English, what I realize is that syntax is really a lot more flexible than people realize. Like adjective order, like post-positive adjectives, and even the what we consider to be standard word order in English. There's still a lot of room for playing with that.
Robert Van Valen, in his Role and Reference Grammar, talks a lot about the flexibility of English grammar, which is pragmatically rigid but syntactically fairly relaxed. So you move words around, you get pragmatic effects in English, and there's a lot of liberty to do that. But metaphor is just, it is a way of so Steve Pinker distinguishes, it's an old distinction, actually. It's not original with him, although some people think it is. It's dead metaphors versus live metaphors. And I first encountered metaphor when I was studying to be a Bible translator. So there was a textbook, which is actually quite a good book aside from the title, which is Translating the Word of God, and TWOG, as we used to say. And it goes into all the different kinds of varieties of non-literal speech, because obviously a translator is going to have to deal with this. And metaphor is very crucial. It's found throughout the Bible. I say unto you, if your faith is like the grain of mustard, and you command this mountain to move into the sea, it will. That's actually false. But this is one of the many silly metaphors that are used, but it's a good metaphor. It gets people to think that I must not have any faith because I can't even get it to tie my shoes, much less move this damn mountain. I got to plow instead. I got to plant my crops and everything. But metaphor is throughout the Bible. You think of the sermons. I used to preach a lot, but now I don't preach. Now I give lectures, and in my lectures, you meet with students who they've never heard of this stuff before. So you try to use metaphors. I'm teaching a class right now, which has nothing to do with linguistics. It's on the culture of Wall Street, and it is. So we talk about derivatives. You know, I'm not a very good person to talk because I've never made a penny in investments that I'm aware of. But derivatives, you know, these were responsible for the crash of 2008, and everybody loves them, but that is not the people who lose money, but the people who put them together and sell them. They love monies, you know, but they explain these things by metaphors. What does it mean, you know, to do this? Even the concept hedge fund, that's a metaphor. You know, what is a hedge? You know, it's like a little row of trees or whatever. And so it's a thing to protect you from the vicissitudes of the market, which turns out to be a metaphor. It's just an abstraction of what little firms, big firms do all day.
Buying and selling. Yeah.
So metaphor can be helpful, but it also can obscure, because once we've got a metaphor, we think we've understood it, right?
Well, I mean, actually, that's something that I want to dive into a little bit deeper in a moment. But I wanted to ask you first, do the Peter Hahn use more abstract metaphors? Like, for example, you know, is heart a metaphor for kind of, you know, spirit and bravery? And do they use abstract metaphors like that?
Yeah, they do. They say things like, you know, he's got a bad head. Okay. But that doesn't mean actually literally that he has a bad head. It just means he makes bad decisions. He does bad things. He violates our cultural values. So that's definitely metaphorical. They don't have heart metaphors, but they have head metaphors, and they have foot metaphors like we've already discussed, and they have penis metaphors. These are the things they really like to, they love genital metaphors, but
oh really? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like teenagers in the United States, right?
Yeah. Well, like everybody in the United States, but we blame teenagers for it. But you know, I mean, you know, he's a dick. You know, that's a great example of metaphor, and I suppose Pinker would call it a dead metaphor, although I don't know how many people actually visualize the male genitalia when you say this, but probably a lot do. So it depends on your exposure to that, and a lot of hilarious drawings and stuff just sort of literalize metaphors. What this would look like. So yeah, the Peter Haas use metaphor all over the place. I've been accused of saying the Peter Haas don't think abstractly. Basically, there are two fundamental distinctions in philosophy between nominalists, people who believe that we only have experience with specific things, and then we invent generalities and causation to connect them, such as David Hume. Or we have realists, who are people who believe that red exists even though you can never see it outside specific red things. You know, there's this thing called redness. So to a nominalist, redness doesn't exist. It's just, it doesn't exist outside the mind. And to a realist, redness does exist outside the mind. Peter Haas, in that sense, would be nominalist. So they tend not to give names for things that would be called universals. It gets a little complicated because they do have generics. But so when people think they think simplistically, nobody thinks that David Hume thinks simplistically, the great Scottish philosopher. But David Hume was a nominalist. The Peter Haas are Amazonian nominalists. They have a sophisticated philosophy about the world, which is at radical odds with contemporary American society. But they still think abstractly. They reason about things, and they use metaphors to help them reason, just as we do.
But is that a little bit like that kind of trick question that high school students ask each other, which is, what was the highest mountain in the world before they discovered Everest?
Right.
Even though Everest wasn't discovered, it was still the highest in the world. But so even though you may not know it exists, there's still a reality out there?
Yeah, but Everest is a specific thing. To say that So do you want to say that there are mountains, or just these individual things that shoot up be above sea level or whatever? Um, eh, so realism and nominalism have an old debate that goes back centuries, and at one time or another, one has been the victor. So Berkeley was the ultimate nominalist, and Kant tried to bridge the gap between realism and nominalism. And some people think that he was more of a nominalist. I just think that, as Peirce says of Kant, he really wasn't very good at logic. But
there's another one with such arrogance, right? Amazing.
Yeah, Peirce thought that Bertrand Russell was a hack who didn't know any math, and anything he did know was plagiarized. I've actually got passages here where Peirce says that.
Wow.
But that's why nobody liked Peirce, because he told everybody that. But the Pitahans are extremely intelligent people. Is there a Nobel Prize winner in physics among the Pitaha? That question doesn't make any sense, because they don't do physics except so if you shoot a fish under the water, right, you don't just shoot at the fish, you shoot below the fish. You have to account for refraction. So you do have to have a theory of physics to be a good hunter, but you don't need to make it much more than applied physics. And so talent, all these things are defined by culture. Talent, to say somebody's talented means they're quite good at something I value. They may be able to train cockroaches. Somebody might think that's talented. Somebody else might think, what a waste of time. It's just, talent is defined culturally. Intelligence is defined culturally. So somebody who sits around the Pitaha contemplating all day is going to be considered a drain on the society, a worthless dweeb, not an intelligent person, like me. They don't understand why I don't starve to death. It just doesn't make any sense. I can't do anything. I don't do anything. I just sit on my butt all day and look at papers. That's the way they describe me to everyone. In fact, years ago, my son, who's at the University of Miami now, Caleb, he was playing with some friends in Brazil, and they were talking about what their dads did. And they said, what does your dad do? Because the fathers told me about this afterwards. He says, oh, he doesn't do anything. He just sits on a chair all day and plays with, looks at paper.
Well, I mean, after my conversations with you, I think that my kind of view of how culture affects pretty much every part of cognition, it always comes to the forefront whenever when people ask me a question, because I'm an Australian living in Spain, so people ask me questions about what's it like in Australia, and for example, I was watching a film recently, an American film, and in the film there's the family sitting around the table, and the son, he's about 20 years old, right? And the mother and father are saying, listen, you're 20 years old. It's time that you got out of this house and went out into the world and got a job and got an apartment, and you can't stay here anymore. And when I was watching it, I looked over at my wife and I said, this conversation in Spain would just never happen. Like, the idea of parents kicking the children out of the house when they're only 20 is totally alien.
My dad started charging me rent when I was 16 because, he said, you're either going to pay rent or get the hell out. But he wouldn't have kicked me out until I was 18. But yeah, my kids were all independent at 18. That's a very strong Anglo-Saxon value, I guess, to get out there and raid the Romans. But
yeah, but here in Spain, parents are happy to have the children at home until they could study, they could be doing a doctorate until they're in their 30s, and it's no problem.
Right. That my view is, in your parents' view, is not universal anymore. But my generation, I think, holds it strong. My wife doesn't feel this way. My first wife certainly did. I try to overcome these feelings, but it irritates me when I see somebody who's over 20 living at home. I still find this irritates me a great deal. I asked my students, I said, how many of you are over 20, and they raised their hands. And I said, how many of you are supported by your parents? And they raised their hands. And I said, this is why the human animal is so unusual, because it takes at least 30 years for our offspring to reach adulthood, independent adulthood, whereas a horse gets it in in a few days.
Oh, well, I can only imagine how upset you'd feel meeting someone from around here who's kind of like 30, and the mother still cooks and the mother still does the washing, and
Yeah.
I just wanted to read, to give people an idea of some of the things that were in the book by Lakoff and Johnson. So they talk about these. Chapter 4 is about orientational metaphors, and they say, for example, that happy is up and sad is down. So I'm feeling up. That boosted my spirits. My spirits rose. You're in high spirits. Thinking about her always gives me a lift. Or the opposite, I'm feeling down. I'm depressed. He's really low these days. I fell into a depression. My spirits sank. And then, the book is full of examples like this about how, like love is a journey, an argument is war. And my question is, does this tell us anything about how language began? Like, because this is probably a question that a lot of people have in their minds is, did it start with just grunting, or did it start with pointing, or, because I know that this is a field of great expertise of yours.
We didn't need many sounds. We don't need many sounds to express ourselves. The more sounds we have, the less ambiguity, but also the more things we have to remember. So I don't think that the number of sounds we were able to produce when we were Homo erectus would have been a limitation on language. It would have been a limitation on the physical instantiation of language, which is speech or signs. I think we communicate with our entire body, so there never would have been a time when we weren't using our whole body to communicate. Our hands, our facial expressions, the sounds we make, all of these things go together. And we can't interpret a sentence effectively if we can't see the person speaking. A blind person has to make all kinds of adjustments to interpret without the visual cues. A deaf person has to make all kinds of adjustments to, so sign languages, full-blown sign languages, have a lot of this stuff built into them. They have intonation, and so they have a lot of this stuff built into them. But I'm sure that blind people can tell you that language is not just the sounds, because there's all kinds of ambiguity. Much of it is cleared up in intonation, but a lot of it relies on expressions and hand gestures and things like this. So we communicate with our bodies, not just with our minds or just with our mouths, but with our entire body. But metaphors almost certainly were important to human reasoning, but they come out of culture. So metaphors and language come from the same source, which is culture. It's once we get together and start to form values and want to communicate those values that we come up with a code for doing it. Now, we need a brain big enough to do that. My dog communicates well with me, and I'm starting to waver on the idea that animals lack symbols at all. But human brains are able to generate new symbols very productively. And as soon as we got to that, and we had a way of physically instantiating those symbols with our bodies, especially with our mouths, because that's very efficient, we began to use metaphors and language much more. But a metaphor, again, to take Peirce's idea, anything can be a metaphor of anything. So it's not the case that up has to be positive and down has to be negative. And I don't think that Lakoff and Johnson explore culture enough, because if they did, they would have found examples like reaching for the stars in Mandarin versus reaching for the stars in English. I think that we have to ask ourselves, is up always positive in every culture? Maybe it isn't. And if it isn't, that shows that it's not innate. Maybe it is. That also does not show that it is innate. It simply shows that there's something about, we're upright. The creatures that we dislike the most are low.
Snakes, spiders, cockroaches.
These are things we don't like. And so we don't want to be down on the ground. We're upright creatures. We tend to value being upright. So things which most correspond to our natural bodily posture, upright, up there, even the fact that we say upright, that's a metaphor, right? Stand up, and sometimes we add these metaphorical prepositions that don't add a whole lot of meaning. Sometimes they add a little bit of grammar, but a lot of grammar. There are reasons where the sources of these metaphors and their basis in a system of symbols or signs, a system of semiotics, that's where the theory resides. That's what we really have to get at if we want to understand these things. Symbols grow over time. Peirce talked about that. And how do they grow? They become richer and richer. If you just take science, what we know about water today is a lot more than what we knew about water a long time ago. But, a million years ago, there was probably a word for water. I think Homo erectus probably had a word for water, but they lacked any chemical knowledge, I suppose, of what water was. So is that the same word? Yes, it is the same word. It's the same symbol, but it's gotten richer over time. We've filled in a lot of the gaps. And metaphors we use when we don't quite understand things. And if you want to see great uses of metaphor, read any religious text. They're full of it because metaphors point to things that we can't perceive directly, right? And since you can never perceive God, he can only be talked about in metaphors because, it's a bunch of BS. And so metaphors help you it actually sounds like you're talking about something. Wittgenstein, and you are in a sense, for Peirce, God is real whether there is an entity that exists outside of language called God or not. We refer to unicorns, and that's perfectly valid inference. A lot of the philosophical problems of how can you refer to something that doesn't exist, Peirce deals with all of these problems very easily. And it's funny because as we've ignored Peirce, philosophers have spent a lot of time trying to talk about things that Peirce had pretty much solved, in fact, completely solved over 100 years ago. So we use diagrams all the time to represent their icons of things. We use them for math. Peirce developed an entire set of diagrams to express very complex logical and mathematical functions. And he said we can think of mathematics as an empirical science if we think about it as manipulating diagrams. So if the diagram doesn't come out right, the mathematical prediction is wrong. So the diagrams, the metaphors are the icons. These are the empirical things we're dealing with. Fascinating views of mathematics as opposed to dealing with things that are never found. Math just deals with icons.
Yeah, it's true, right? Because maths essentially is an abstract idea in itself. The idea of numbers and I don't know. Is one really a thing, or is it just something that we invented?
The relationship 1 + 2 can be shown diagrammatically. 1 can be shown as a diagram. 2 can be shown as a diagram. Well, the Piraha don't use these things. But there are cultures that have division, but don't have it outside of diagrams. So there's an Amazonian culture, and I'm trying to remember the name, I'm forgetting, that was first told to me by Brazilian scholar Arion Rodrigues, who talked about he didn't think they had numbers. And this was even before I was claiming the Piraha didn't have numbers. But he said they divide things exactly. And how do they do that? They sit around in a circle, and each one makes a little trough in front of him. And then they go around and just flop things out into those troughs until they run out. So that's sort of like division by diagram without numbers. You can actually do the operations without the words up to a point. Just depends on how much you've developed the diagrams. And then, so diagrams are in a sense icons of other things. Metaphors are icons, but they're they're more nebulous in some ways. Well, they're more free. We have greater freedom, because you take any diagram, it cannot be a diagram of anything else. It has to be a diagram of things that share certain very obvious properties. Whereas a metaphor, I can say, he's like a duckbill. What do I mean by that? You can think of all kinds of meanings. He's like, he's like a feather. He's like an iPhone. He's like, you can do this with anything. And our culture tells us to explore, and then we come up with meanings and we agree, oh yeah, he's like an iPhone in this way. He never stops bothering me.
Well, a few months ago, I spoke to this guy called Peter Gardenfors, and he's working with these things he calls conceptual spaces. And so in his theory, these spaces exist below metaphors. So, for example, you would have a space which is where the sound of music exists, and then different cultures map the metaphor onto that space. So, for example, in English, we have high and low. Sounds we say a note is high or a note is low, but in some Eastern European languages, they would say like a note is thick or thin. So it's almost, and this sort of brings me back to my question. So because I saw this comic strip, and at the bottom of the comic it says, etymology was a lot easier back in the prehistoric period. And there's these two cavemen talking, and the one of the cavemen has a rock, and he says, this is called a rock because last week Zog said it was a rock. Right?
Right.
And so, like, obviously the words that we have and the concepts we have, they sort of came from somewhere. And, is that kind of, is it from Peirce's kind of ideas of signs and indexes and symbols, or is it more like, is it sound symbolism? Is it metaphor? What's the most likely source for language?
All of these things, these conceptual spaces that Gardenfors talks about, are simply icons in Peirce's system. So Peirce's system of semiotics is a logical system, and it's built on logical constraints that he called speculative grammar. However, that's just the skeleton, and all languages have to plug into that skeleton, not because it's hardwired. This has nothing to do with Peirce's ideas, but because this is the only logical way these things can relate. But where do we get the values that up is good and down is bad, or thick is this and thin is that? We get these things from our culture. Our culture fills in the gaps. It tells us what the meanings are and how to think about things. And this is hard for people to do it. So most philosophers working today, most linguists working today, the vast majority have no concept of either semiotics or culture. They know these things are out there, but they don't see the relevance to what they're doing. So you find people writing about metaphor at length, which lack any theory of how metaphor emerges from a theory of signs. And they talk about meanings, but they don't realize that meanings grow out of culture. One of the first major books on meaning in English was Ogden and Richard's The Meaning of Meaning. And this was, interestingly enough, the first introduction to Peirce's ideas in the UK, because Peirce was corresponding with a woman in the UK, Lady Victoria Welby, or Victoria Lady Welby, and she was talking to everybody like Bertrand Russell, and she was well-connected, wealthy person. She lived in Frogmore, so she was her aunt was Queen Victoria. So she was well-connected and really, really smart, and she wrote books, and she developed her whole theory called significance, which was about meaning. And she told Russell about this brilliant work of Peirce, and she told Ogden and Richards about it. So this woman was linking all these theories of meaning, even though most of these people weren't reading Peirce directly. She was corresponding with him, and she was sharing her letters from him with these people. And but people who work outside this theory, who come along and think that inventing tree structure is some innovation, or conceptual spaces, or cognitive maps, these just are all less well worked out versions of semiotics. And in many cases, they're inventing the wheel, and they're reinventing the wheel, and they don't realize it, because Peirce's work has sat in obscurity for so long, because when he died, without any connections, it was just a mass of papers in his house, and Harvard sent down a wagon with a couple of guys, a philosophy professor at Harvard, Josiah Royce, who had been Peirce's student, and they threw all his papers in the back of this wagon, and they gave his wife a little bit of money, and they took him up to Harvard, and they dumped them in a big room, literally, and people were stealing parts of them and looking at other parts, and they lost a bunch, and eventually somebody said, these could be valuable. And so they started going through them, because Royce died right after they got them, and so he wasn't able to, or not long afterwards. And so now they're realized as one of the great repositories of wisdom in the world, and they're all at the Houghton Library at Harvard, and they've been through years and years of work, they've been somewhat organized, and so people like me can go in there and sit at a desk and read all these papers and come up with their own order and their own theories of these things. But much of scholarship until recently, Peirce was the inventor of analytic philosophy. Metaphor falls into this. Peirce's PhD student was Josiah Royce. Royce's student was C.I. Lewis. Lewis's student was Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine. His student was Donald Davidson. So a lot of people don't realize how profound the Peircean influence is throughout Western philosophy. Wittgenstein rewrote the Tractatus because Frank Ramsey apparently told him that it was wrong, and he showed him Peirce's reasoning when it was wrong. So Wittgenstein wrote another book called Philosophical Investigations, a whole new theory of philosophy, which in fact is compatible with Peirce.
Unbelievable.
But people miss these roots. They don't get the history of these things. So metaphor is something that is crucial to our understanding, to our communication. Lakoff and Johnson were some of the first people to really get on and show us the importance of all this stuff. There are many laboratories in embodied cognition that take metaphor very seriously, and look for the lessons we can learn about the way we think through the metaphors we use. But even those groups, which are so serious and so good, they're doing such great stuff, don't very often overlook the fact that what we're talking about is something precognitive, culture. I shouldn't say precognitive, because the relationship between culture and cognition is symbiotic. Each one builds the other. So one reason we wouldn't say that dogs have culture is because they lack the cognitive abilities. But as soon as they start to get a threshold of cognitive abilities enough to get culture, then that helps create more cognitive abilities. And language eventually comes along as a good idea.
So why do you think that Peirce's theories are not more integrated into modern linguistics?
Well, because at the time that modern linguistics, so some linguists did recognize it. So the very, very important path-breaking linguist Roman Jakobson, who, a very interesting history, born in the Soviet Union, left at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, went to Czechoslovakia, left at the time of the Nazi assumption of, Hitler's rise to power, came to the US, got a job at Columbia, had a student called Morris Halley, and another person who hired a student called Noam Chomsky, and those two guys were deeply influenced by him. He wrote a very early article on the importance of Peirce and his brilliance for modern linguistics, which Chomsky has called Peirce his favorite philosopher. He does use some of Peirce's ideas, but not very well. But that's understandable, because his papers were so disorganized. It took a lot of work, and Chomsky was interested in developing his own theory. So that took off, and now for people to say, "Oh, whoa, wait a minute, 100 years before Chomsky, there was a guy already writing about universal grammar that solves a lot of the problems that we have today that we can't solve. So you get a verb like give. I give John the book, okay? That's got 3 arguments. As far as we can tell, there is no verb in any language that has more than 3 arguments. Peirce predicts that, and he works it out, and he says this is why. Now, somebody told me the other day, I bet you $5 it's going to rain. And they say, so that has 4 arguments. But it's going to rain is not an argument of the verb I bet. It's just filling in extra information. It's the content of the bet. So it's grammatical to say, I bet you $5. But it's not grammatical to say, I gave Bill, or I gave $2. So you've got to have an indirect object and a direct object. Peirce figured all this out long before, and modern linguistics hasn't even gotten a good explanation of that yet.
Well, I mean, I think I don't know how Peirce's theory takes into account other kind of modern, well, I mean, like for example, like usage-based grammar. I've become a massive fan of construction grammar.
So am I. I'm a huge fan of construction grammar, but there are 2 things to say about it relative to Peirce that come to me right at the top of my head. First, constructions are signs, they're symbols. So Peirce would have predicted pretty much all their properties, and he does. So a construction is a sign. Second, they're signs that come out of culture. Peirce's great weakness is that he had no theory of culture. He talked about the growth of symbols and collateral information, which are clearly intended to refer to culture. But, he was writing before there was much culture. His student, John Dewey, became great friends with the founder of American anthropology, Franz Boas. Their offices were right down the hall from each other at Columbia. So through Dewey, Boas started to get some of Peirce's ideas. Unfortunately, the person whose ideas, William James was also influenced by Peirce, and he wrote a lot more, he published a lot more, his ideas were better known. So most people have come to Peirce through the very imperfect understanding of Peirce that William James had. Probably Peirce's best friend. So pragmatism is from Peirce, not from James, although James is often given the credit. This and semiotics influence and pragmatism influence Boas very heavily. They influenced my teacher, Kenneth Pike, who studied with Sapir, who was a student of Boas. And so there are plenty of reasons why Peirce's ideas have been ignored, mainly having to do with the way his papers were treated by Harvard and the fact that he was dead. And I'm not saying that Peirce solved everything, but at some point, everything links back to signs. And that Peirce has worked out, and nobody's improved on it in that period of time, because he looked at it as a mathematical, logical thing. So he's worked out, it's like nobody has improved on arithmetic. You could maybe say that again. Gödel has shown certain properties of arithmetic, but nobody's come up with a better way of saying 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, that's just the way it is if you buy into the concept of arithmetic, which many stockbrokers do not. But so if you buy into the notion that there are these signs and Peirce has worked out the logic, this is the way it has to be. So it's not like. So it's not quite as empirical. It's based on empirical studies, but then you plug things into that, and you can test it. I mean, you can see, does it work? So people could reject it because they don't think it works. But he certainly had a lot to say about metaphor and about diagrams and about analogy and all of these things long before other people were even thinking about these ideas.
One of the more kind of freaky things for me that you've kind of talked about is embodied cognition. This idea that our brain and our body are living in symbiosis. I mean, I know that seems obvious, but
according to Descartes, they would be living in symbiosis. According to embodied cognitive people, there's no difference. There's no more difference between your brain and your body than there is between your nose and your body. To say, oh, my nose is, the equivalent of saying your brain is living in symbiosis with your body is saying that your nose has a life of its own, or your finger does, or your anus. I mean, these are just organs of the body. These are just parts of the body, and when you get sick, you don't think as well. Case closed. There is embodied cognition. Your brain is just tied into your body. It has a function. It is the thinking part of your body, but so are your fingers. And there are a lot of cool experiments at the Fisher Lab in Potsdam, University of Potsdam, which is really fascinating, where they have people do math problems where their hands are all wired up to measure what's going on with their hands. People don't think as well if they can't use their fingers in math. They can't play the guitar. I try to show my grandson how to play certain songs, and I forget how to tell him to play them. So I have to play it a little bit. My body has to get involved. Until my body gets involved, my memory is screwed.
Well, I mean, even I've read some preliminary research that suggests that maybe Parkinson's disease starts in the gut, that it's some sort of bacteria, maybe,
Yeah, you eat too many cold cuts growing up, and you may have Alzheimer's when you get older. I mean, the brain is just an organ of the body. It's damaged by the same sorts of things. Our thinking is dependent on our body, like our heartbeat is dependent on our body. And so embodied cognition, a lot of it is deeply influenced by the work of Lakoff and Johnson in particular. This was, even though I think it lacks a good theory of metaphor, it does have a huge amount of applications of metaphor, and it has been a hugely important book in our science about the mind and about culture.
Yeah, because I mean, for example, one part of embodied cognition is something called the action sentence compatibility effect, and there's an experiment here where they read sentences to the volunteers, like, for example, you handed Courtney the notebook, and then they have two buttons. One button is closer to them, one button's further away, and if they press the button that's further away from them, when they say a sentence, which is when they have to give something, away from their body, if those things match, if the action and the sentence match, then they do it a lot faster than if they're doing the opposite action. So
this is Worfianism, basically, that the form of our language affects the form of our thought. And so part of that is metaphorical, but you can find the same thing when people navigate. They grow up in a society like the Piraha, where all navigation terms are absolute. They can actually navigate in a new environment more effectively than English speakers who grow up with relative terms like in front of me, to your side, right, and left. And so some of this is metaphorical, but it's also the way we use our bodies. And this is all compatible to Peirce's work. So when he talks about these things, he is illustrating metaphor, but it's only as part of a much larger phenomenon of culture-based reasoning.
Well, that's actually the final thing that I want to sort of talk to you about, which is just some examples of how this Worfian effect, works with metaphor. So there's some great work, which is, I'm not sure of the pronunciation of his name, but I think it's Thibodeau and Boroditsky, and they did quite a few different experiments together, where they used different metaphors to talk about different things, and then they asked people what their reactions would be. So, for example, they described crime using the metaphor of a virus, and then they described crime using the metaphor of a beast. And depending on which metaphor they used, people chose whether to use social reform as the cure for this virus, or whether to use things like prison and law enforcement if it's a beast. So it seems that there's this deep and subconscious connection between whatever the metaphor is underneath the language and maybe even how we view the world.
No, that's very true. But what lies beneath the metaphor? Where do the metaphors come from? This is the question that's not asked that much. And the metaphors arise from our culture because we value beasts in one way. We value other things in another way. We could talk about things as beasts. We can talk about them as not beasts. If we have negative feelings towards certain beasts, we will react in one way. If we have positive feelings, we'll react in another way. So again, we get back to the idea that anything can be a metaphor of anything else. It just depends on our culture, and what we choose to focus on is the connections. And if the connections are positive, they're going to be different reactions than if we chose a negative connections. So it's this huge communicative and interpretive flexibility that we have that underlies all of this. There's nothing in the metaphor itself that explains this. Metaphor is, again, just a subtype of icon. And so to understand metaphors, we have to understand icons. And to understand icons, we have to understand this theory of signs. And understand that, we have to understand semiotics. But to understand semiotics, which even Peirce missed, we have to understand culture. What is it that underwrites all of this? It is our society, our community, that decides. We focus on the mind more because we're Cartesian dualists. And people who want to talk about cognition as opposed to culture or as opposed to the body are simply buying into Cartesian dualism. The idea that the mind is simply different from the body. The mind is immaterial, the body is material, or something very similar to that, that somehow it makes sense to talk. In a sense, we can have a theory of the liver, and we can have a theory of the heart. There are cardiologists, and there are whatever, liverologists. We can have these theories, but nobody would seriously propose a theory of the heart that didn't look at its connections within the body. And yet many people are quite happy to talk about the brain without talking about its connections to the body. And so we have these silly ideas, these metaphors, like the movie Matrix, where the brain in the vat, which goes, back to Hilary Putnam and many other philosophers. There can't be a brain in the vat, right? The brain is in the vat already. It's called the body, and you can't take the brain out of the body. It doesn't work. So all these ideas of uploading the brain's memories as software, you can upload some memories as software, I'm sure. We do this all the time. I write my memories down in my diary every day. So you can put some of the memories outside your body, but my diary is not going to come up with a theory of how I should behave over the next year. And neither is this computer, because it doesn't have my body, it doesn't have my culture, it doesn't have my background. And these are things that only dualists would conceive of the world without these kinds of things. So Descartes' effect on our views of metaphor, on our views of the mind, on our views of language have been pernicious. And if I were teaching a class on a new theory of language, I would say the first thing you have to do is completely ignore Descartes. Just put that stuff in the trash. It's a historical curiosity. And I'm obviously exaggerating here. I mean, he was a great mathematician, and he did get us to focus on a lot of parts of thinking ability in humans, which everybody wants to study. He just did it. Peirce worked very hard to undo the effects of Cartesianism, like intuition, introspection, the idea that we can start with doubt, which was Descartes' big idea. Peirce says we can never relieve ourselves of doubt. All we can do is start working and be ready to modify our beliefs as we go along, because we all, belief is the removal of doubt. So we can't get rid of our beliefs, because those are the things we don't doubt. And we can't doubt the things we don't doubt. That doesn't make any sense. So Descartes started on the wrong, I think, therefore I am. No, you eat food, therefore you are. I mean, it's his whole thing of dividing the body, he could have said, I have to urinate, therefore I am. I mean, that makes as much sense. It doesn't. So a lot of these ideas of looking at this one thing like metaphor and thinking, so you can look at metaphor, you can study metaphor, but you have to see what's it connected to. Just like you study the heart, you have to know that it's connected to the lungs, it gets blood, it's connected to the liver, to the brain. You have to understand that metaphor is connected to culture, metaphors. And so I'm using a metaphor, bodily organs, to talk about human invention, which metaphor is.
So what would be the one thing that you want everybody to know about metaphor, not just in in language, but in cognition?
Metaphor is extremely important to understanding our species, how we think, how we relate to each other, how we talk about the world, how we conceive the world. And Lakoff and Johnson are owed an incredible debt by everybody for their pioneering breakthrough work on showing us examples. But ultimately, metaphor can only be understood as a small part of the theory of semiotics and human culture that underwrites all metaphors.